Once there was a lad named Jack, and he worked for a wealthy laird on the laird's estate. And that laird had so much money, but he held it tight, and he only paid Jack 1 penny a week for all of his hard work. But for the most part, that didn't bother Jack. Jack lived with his old mum in a cozy stone cottage, and she was a canny old woman. She knew how to find the ripest berries on the hedgerows, and she knew how to gather fleece that the sheep had left behind in the thickets that they passed through. And she knew how to make the most powerful poultices from the most ordinary-looking plants. And with the cures that she made, and with the strong yarn that she spun from that fleece, and the jams that she made with the berries, well, she earned a lot of coins, and with his penny a week, they had enough. But that's not what Jack was thinking about on this day. On this day, which just happened to be the longest day of the year, Midsummer's Eve, he was thinking about Jenny. He was sitting in the meadow at the foot of a little hill. There was a forest behind him, and in front of him were the laird's sheep. He was watching them, and he was thinking about Jenny. Jenny worked for the laird. She was a maid in the great estate manor house, and Jack fancied Jenny. And Jenny, just the other day, had made it quite clear that she fancied him right back. But it would take a lot more than 1 penny a week to make a life for him and Jenny. And just as he was thinking about this, there was a great commotion of birds flying overhead, flapping their wings and talking all at once, and they landed in the trees just behind him. Now his old mother knew the language of the birds, and she taught him that language, and he listened. The sparrows, the magpies, the crows, they were all talking all at once, it seemed. Tonight's the night. These trees will dance with no thought for their feathered friends. It happens only once in 100 years. Dancing trees! What will happen next? And with that, all of the birds flew up and out of the trees and flew off. They were gone. Just as he was trying to figure out what they could have meant by that, he noticed his old mum coming across the field, bringing his bread and cheese for lunch, and he went out to meet her, told her what he had heard. I've heard tales about this, she said. I've heard that on Midsummer's Eve, the old oak that some call Old Cruvy lifts himself up out of the earth and dances with the birch maidens that grow so coyly around him. And she looked around to see if anyone else could hear. It's said that the trees keep their treasure hidden in their roots. But a treasure seeker has to be careful not to lose himself in the seeking, or he could end up being flattened. Here, take a ball of my yarn, she said. Could come in handy. And off she went, across the meadow, gathering bits of fleece as she went. Just as he was looking at this tight ball of yarn, all wound up so neatly and tightly, he heard Jenny's voice. Jack! She was coming down the path from the manor house. Jack, I've just come to warn you. The laird's in a right state. He keeps saying something about tonight's the night and shouting at anyone who gets in his way. So I've just come to warn you, stay out of his way, stay clear. Better avoid him altogether. Be on your best behavior. I don't know what's gotten into him. I think I might, said Jack, and he told her what he had heard from the birds and from his mum. I know what you're thinking, said Jenny. Don't do it. Don't do what? It's too dangerous, she said. Which was when Jack knew exactly what he was going to do. He was going to stay and watch the trees dance. Jenny tried to argue him out of it. If the laird catches you, you could be fired or worse, she said. But she had to hurry across back to the manor house or she'd get in trouble herself. Well, Jack, he did wait. He waited all day, that beautiful, long midsummer's day, and he waited until the sun had finally dipped to the horizon. It was strangely quiet without any of the birds. But then he heard an otherworldly kind of music. And then he heard a sigh and a moan, and a crack and a groan, and the great oak before his eyes, he heaved himself up out of the ground, and with his long ropey roots he began to dance down the hill. And the 12 birch maidens all around him, they shimmied and shook themselves right up out of the ground, and they danced along beside him. And they made their way down the hill, pounding back and forth. Jack was just about to follow them down the hill when he saw a shadow moving in between the trees, and he noticed there was the laird. The laird had come to the edge of the great hole, the root hole left by the old oak, and he jumped in. Jack crept up close, and he saw it was a deep hole, and it was filled with gems glittering in the moonlight. Gold and silver and gems of all sizes and colors, and the laird was plucking them out and filling his sack as fast as he could. Well, Jack crept over and he looked into the root hole left behind by one of the birch trees. It wasn't as deep and there wasn't as much treasure, but there was some glittering in the moonlight. He saw the trees making their way down the hill. The pounding was more gentle and far away, and he thought of his mum and how hard she worked to put food on the table, and he thought of Jenny and how much he wanted to marry her. He'd only be in there for a minute. He'd be back out before the trees came back, and he jumped in. It was deeper than he thought it was going to be, and there was more treasure than he thought there was going to be too. There was a beautiful blue sapphire. He plucked it out of the side of the earth, and the earth trickled down onto his feet. And there beside it, a gold ring, just the size of Jenny's finger. And then he heard Jenny's voice. "Jack! Jack! You've got to come up! The trees are coming back!" He put the ring and the sapphire into his pocket, just beside the ball of yarn his mom had given him. And then he began to clamber up out of the root hole. But the earth just crumbled beneath his fingers and his feet. He couldn't get a handhold or a foothold on the earth, and he couldn't climb out. And then he thought of the ball of yarn in his pocket, and he took it out, and he held the end, and he tossed it up to Jenny. "Catch!" He watched it unravel. Just enough left for her to catch. And she tied it to a sturdy shrub right beside the root hole, and he pulled on it, and it seemed strong enough, but would it hold him? "Hurry, Jack, hurry!" Hand over hand he went, and the strong yarn woven by his mum's strong fingers held him, and he climbed up and out of the root hole and onto the ground. "Come on, Jack." And she took his hand. "Just a minute," he said, and he went over to the root hole, and there, where old Cruvy had been, was the laird, still stuffing his sack. It was bursting with jewels. "Laird," he said, "you've got to get out. The trees are coming back." But the laird, his eyes glittered with greed. He was taken by the gems. "Laird," said Jack, "hold yourself up on this. Pull yourself out with this." And he threw the yarn into him. Jenny tugged at his hand. They ran down the hill just as the trees were reaching the top of the other side of the hill. And they ran all the way to Jack's mum's house. And there Jack's mum was waiting with them, with dinner ready for both of them. Well, the next day, they made their way back to the forest, and there was the great oak, and all of the birch trees back in their places. No sign of the dancing of the night before, except for the yarn, Jack's mum's yarn, that was still tied round the bush and ran down beneath the roots of the old oak and disappeared. There was no sign of the laird. Well, it didn't take Jack long to put that ring on Jenny's finger. And they were married and moved into the old stone cottage, and Jack's mum, she sold the blue sapphire and bought herself a little house by a loch. And she lived happily ever after. And of the laird? Well, the laird was never seen again. His son inherited the old manor house and the estate, and it turned out that the laird's son was a much more generous employer than his father had been, and Jack and Jenny both got a big raise.